Support for Flying Valiant Builds is brought to you by 1st and 64th Customs on YouTube, where no diecast is safe. Video Geek Productions. All business, all geek. A generous grant from the Jonathan Vonesh Foundation. And from support from viewers like you. Please like, share, and subscribe. Okay, first commission. Gonna build a wagon for Ben. And he says, I can paint it any color but red. So why am I only seeing red? Hey there folks, Chuck here. As I mentioned in a previous video, I made my first custom sale with the Nova from episode 7, and Ben, the buyer, liked it so much he sent me this wagon to build as a gift for his dad. I've never done a commissioned weathered vehicle before, but Ben kindly gave me carte blanche to build the car however I wanted, and purposefully gave me no notes so I'd build it exactly how I saw fit. The only stipulation was that he said it couldn't be red, and so after a week of staring at the car and seeing only red, I finally found the direction I wanted to go. But before I get started on the build, I wanted to do a quick shout out to David over at the completely inaccurately named The Worst YouTube Channel Ever, who kindly sent me this van from his collection for a future project. I'm really excited about this. This is exactly the van that I needed to do this project, and he found out I needed it and sent it my way. So please check out his channel for great videos about collecting diecast vehicles. I'll link to it below. It's thanks to folks like David and my amazing patrons that I'm able to continue doing this as the beer virus continues to mess with my day job. Okay, back to the car. This 1970 Chevelle Wagon is a Hot Wheels tooling released in 2009. I'm not that strong on my cars from the general, so I didn't realize Chevelle Wagons were actually a thing. I thought they'd be called like Biscaynes or something, but apparently they were. I'm pretty sure they didn't come with cowl induction hoods though, so I'll have to address that. My immediate reaction to this car was parts hauler, and the scattered parts molded into the cargo area tell me that Phil over at Hot Wheels was thinking the same thing. Unfortunately, you can barely see these parts, so I knew I'd have to do something about that as well. And on that note, let's boogie. My promise to myself that I wouldn't cut this car immediately went out the window after seeing those parts, and I figured just cutting the gate out would be a pretty simple way to draw attention to those cool molded pieces in the back. And it almost was as simple as I thought it would be. It was a little trickier than I expected, but I got it done. The important thing that I've learned with using jeweler's saws is to lubricate them with a beeswax or some kind of oil, and that really helps. Thanks again to Christian at 1st and 64th Customs for that advice. I decided to get the dip in the pickle jar out of the way pretty early. Even though I fog my glass frequently, the parts of the glass that aren't dulled, I want to have the sheen of real glass. So Pledge Floor Polish does that job and really provides a good contrast between the matte and the shine. Dents again, courtesy of the Dremel tool and some 500 grit sandpaper to calm down the harsh edges. I tried to balance the damage on the car more this build, so there'd be a bit of interest on each side. The dent was probably bigger than it needed to be, but it ended up turning out better than I expected it would after the paint. I decided to not fill it in and start over and just trusted myself that I could fix it later on, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Since I was building this car for Ben to give his dad as a gift, and they're both Chevys with cowl induction hoods, I decided to give them similar weathering with a few color cues that would tie the two together, sort of like a family resemblance. In this case, that meant that they would both have charcoal gray hoods and the interiors would match the color of the exterior. Blue has always been my Achilles heel when it comes to weathering. It's not that I can't do it, it just is so much easier to weather with green and yellow. So I decided I'd push myself and figure out a better way to do blue with this build. I'm continuing to play with starting the chassis on a lighter color, like this aged concrete, and letting the darks come through in the washes and accents. I think it works with these smaller scales where a little pigment goes a long way. What do you think? Let me know if you have a technique for weathering chassis in the comments. Unfortunately, I remembered after I'd painted that I was going to do rear view mirrors on this car, and that meant I had to drill and touch up a little later. But Luckily, with weathered builds, this sort of move looks intentional, so let's all just pretend I did it on purpose. Mirrors are pretty easy to make from old axles with a good cutter like my lineman's pliers and an old pair of toenail clippers. The fine edge of the clippers lets you get a bend right after the axle head, but they aren't so fine that they clip the axle. Then, once you cut them down to size, you just drill a 1mm or 3/64" hole where you want them to go, and check that you have clearance for the interior piece on the other side. Super glue, and boom! Mirror. Also, be prepared with spares, because if one of them goes shooting across the room, I guarantee you will never see it again. I wanted to do a replacement panel on this build, and since it was a 4-door wagon, there were lots of panels to choose from. I picked the passenger door to balance out the dent on the other side of the car, and because I liked the idea of having a contrasting panel on the interior of the car as well. Of course, then there's the tie-in with the Nova and the matching dark gray hoods. Another thing I liked about the replacement panels is you have an excuse to do a different type of weathering on that panel, and it's okay because it came off a different used car, but more on that later. A trick with this build was remembering to follow up the weathering that I gave the rest of the body on the tailgate, which is mounted on the chassis interior portion of the car, so it didn't get left out. And an easy crutch for this would have been to just do the tailgate in a different color, but I really wanted it to tie in with the rest of the car, and since it was already open, I figured it was interesting enough, and I figured with it being blue and the car being blue, it would help tie the top and bottom of the car together. Chipping is quickly becoming my favorite part of the process, and the Vallejo German Black Brown is a great base to start from. I really wanted to push myself on roof weathering this go-around, and decided I was going to do almost the entire roof in corrosion and rust. I used chocolate brown as the chipping base for the tan door just to make it look like it aged differently, so it has a slightly lighter chipping base than the rest of the car. After an entire evening of playing with rust accents, streaks, and finally a rust wash, I still wasn't quite satisfied with the roof. I decided I'd come back to it, but not until after adding some rain streaks on the hood to add a third dimension of weathering to it. As I was cleaning up for the night, I used the rubber watercolor pencil from AK Interactive around the window openings to simulate weather stripping, and that's when I remembered how much I liked the chipping color pencil from them. So the next night I attacked the roof again with it and my grandfather's boar's hair stippling brush, and finally got the look I was going for. It really helped tie all of the different colors that were already there together and added that extra texture I was looking for. I used the concrete marks and dust rain streaks pencils to add some grittiness around the base of the car. I'm still disappointed with the dust rain pencil, as it seems to be almost too subtle to be practical, but I'm still messing with it. My love of the Gundam markers is starting to ebb as I'm realizing how quickly they're drying out. Even the gray one, which I've only used once or twice, is practically useless now. I'm gonna switch to the ultrafine point Sharpies that you can get at your local office supply store for a couple bucks and see how they compare. The tip seems to be about the same width. It's about 0.7 millimeters. Thanks to my patrons, I was able to pick up some new metallic paints. I bought a trio of silvers from Master Series Paint that included this tarnished steel. There was also blackened steel and silver. This tarnished steel is a great color and it works well for being an acrylic material. Oil-based, I think, is still better when it comes to getting the right metallic shine for like shiny metal. But for weather-beaten stuff, acrylics have this great dull look about them. I'm going to be using the Molotow pens later in the build, but I like having multiple sheens of metal to work with, as cars come with a mix of chrome, stainless, aluminum, etc. So all of those wear differently, and you end up with different finishes on different parts of the car. And the assortment of metallics really gives the car depth, a lot more than if you're just using that same silver chrome paint for everything. Oyster white over the silver for the headlights. Again, I find it helpful to avoid true black and true white whenever possible, since those two colors usually don't last long in the real world. I did learn my lesson, and I'm starting to clear coat things before busting out the chrome pens, because it really makes cleaning up mistakes with the pen easier, and a stray chrome drop doesn't send you back to the paint stripper. You can just wipe it away. Blue tack works great as a glass mask. I added a few windshield scratches with a probe tool before shooting the matte clear, and then immediately removed the mask so it didn't peel when it dried. To mix it up from my last build, I did almost all my undercarriage weathering with my AK interactive pencils, and I was quite happy with the results. I was also able to try a new trick with the pencils by wetting both the pencil and the brush, and flicking the pencil with the brush to get random splatter. The result was very subtle, and I liked it. I'm going to keep trying that on future builds. The trick with these cars is remembering what you can see when the car is all together. While painting the chassis, I remembered that you can see the underside of the body casting, so I painted it tarnished black just so the eye isn't drawn to anything past the wheels. Conveniently, while I was doing some washes, another package of patron supplies arrived, including this MIG filter set that I was very excited to try. Especially sun bleach. I thought the interior was a perfect place to give it a go. The result was interesting. I think because of the blue, it greened the interior more than I would have liked, but I get where the filter's going, and I really want to try it on the exterior of a build next time. The dust and dirt filters were also interesting. I think they're going to take some more time to master, and I'll do a more thorough review of them as I try them on a fresh build. Again, the light rust, AK pencil, and stipple brush were great for adding pits to the bumper, especially along the bottom. If you look at a lot of older bumpers, they'll still be pretty shiny chrome on the top, and then the bottoms will be all kind of peely, pitted reddish metal. So the stippling brush does a great job of simulating that on these little bumpers. I used old parchment craft paint to mimic torn upholstery and exposed foam, and after it dried, I just picked at it with a dry toothpick a little to get some of the parchment color off and give it a ragged edge. It's not something you're really going to see from outside the car, but I know it's there, and now you know it's there, so we can all enjoy it together. Hey, please don't forget to punch all the buttons under this video and check the description for references to everything I've discussed in this episode. I 3D printed a steering wheel to replace the rubber nub that is usually on these Hot Wheels cars, and just touched it with a little Vallejo wood and some MSP tarnished steel for the metal parts, and really added a lot to the interior. It really looks good looking at it from outside the car. I used the red primer pencil to give the shift ball a little pop of red, and a few touches of wash here and there to add some contrast. I kept finding myself going back to the washes to add bits of depth between the different parts of the chassis. This had a surprisingly detailed chassis for being a Hot Wheels car. Once I felt like I had the chassis under control, I brushed on some matte clear just to seal everything up. I love the Vallejo matte finish, but it's not quite as dull as I would like it to be. I've actually got some new stuff coming that I want to try out that's supposed to be even better at getting a dull finish. Then switching to the gloss varnish to coat the headlights to give them just a little bit of extra sheen. With the turn signals, I decided to go with a straight orange paint instead of using transparent amber this time around, just so they would stand out a little more. I like the transparent amber, but sometimes it can be a little too subtle, and I felt with the griminess of this car that it would be fun to have little bursts of color here and there, and that's why I kept the Maltau pen areas pretty bright. I didn't do a lot of dulling on them either, because I felt like this car needed a little contrast to it so it didn't look too muddy. So the orange from the turn signals and the bright chrome in the rear windows and on the hood pins are my bursts of contrast for this build. I felt like no parts hauler would be complete without a tarp in the back, and making that was pretty simple. I just raided our gift wrap supply and found some white tissue paper and cut a small rectangle. It was a little breezy, so it almost blew away. And then it's just a simple matter of mixing a little white glue with some water and dabbing it in where you need it to go, and letting it dry. I've seen some amazing stuff done with simulating tarps with acrylic resin, and I really want to try that, but for right now, this does the job just fine. Just use a toothpick to shape the tarp and get it folded and wrinkled where you need it. Once it's all dry, it's very easy to just brush some acrylic paint over it. I went with orange to contrast the blue, and because I'm in Gainesville, so go Gators. And then mixed a little aged concrete into the orange to lighten it up and do some highlight tones on all the raised areas. I'm not going too overboard because I know ultimately I'm going to be washing it, like you see here. and most of those highlights are going to get lost. Plus, I'm going to be putting stuff on top of it. I had 3D printed some accessories for the hippie van that I ended up not using, and this was the perfect place to showcase those. I also used my Tamiya weathering powders. The light sand really does a good job at simulating dust, especially on like the dashboard. I was really happy with how that turned out. This is a 3D printed milk crate that I made. There's a couple of brake drums in the bottom of the crate and a little 3D printed air cleaner up top. Once I had it glued into the tailgate and this gas can that was also supposed to go on the hippie van, but I ended up not needing it. It was just a matter of gluing those in place and strategically placing them to hide any imperfections in the cuts in the tailgate. The wheels and tires were a gift from TK Diecast, so thank you, Travis. I kept them pretty simple, just typhus corrosion and Ryza rust from Citadel, and used a step bit to put the tires on my drill and used the emery board to quickly weather them down. I wanted them to have a dry, dusty look, and I thought the new filters would be great for this. So I put the general dust on top of the Goodyears and wasn't super thrilled with it. It's a fine effect. It was a little too subtle for what I was going for. So I went back to my old standard, which is the Doc's weathering powders, and just threw the tires in thinking this will waste less dust. It ended up not quite being as efficient as I thought it would be because they were still a little damp from the filter, so they ended up picking up a lot more dust than I thought they would, so I had to spend some time brushing them off. But once I had them brushed off, I put a little pigment fixer on them, and that really did the trick. That was kind of magic to watch those go on. Then it was just a matter of super gluing the wheels and tires into place, and then it was time to button everything together. The front was easy because I had that post to crank down on, but with this car, because of it being a station wagon, there was a metal tab that came off of the tailgate and went down through the chassis to hold it together, kind of like a snap together pivot point, and the front rivet held the front together. Unfortunately, when it came to cutting the tailgate open, that meant I lost that tab, which meant there was nothing to hold the back shut. And everything inside the car was held in place from the pressure of that tab and the rivet up front, which meant not only did I have to squeeze everything shut and glue it into place, but ultimately ended up taking everything apart and filing down the glass of the car so that there would be more clearance for the interior, so there wasn't as much pressure from the base of the interior pressing up against the glass, which was pressing up against the roof of the car, and then the chassis smashing all of that together so that it would hold together long enough for the glue to cure. So that's a word of warning for you if you ever want to do an open tailgate on this particular casting. It ended up holding just fine though, and I'm pretty happy with the results. Unfortunately, after I got it all set together, I realized just how much slop was in the front wheels, so I cut some Q-tips with the plastic center tubes to make some spacers for the front wheels. The backs were fine, there wasn't as much slop back there, but it was an unacceptable amount of slop when it came to the wheels on the front of the car. So those little spacers really did a good job of holding anything in place. I also ran into the problem of suspension height being an issue because this car was originally designed to be lowered and with a slight rake to it. So I ended up drilling new holes for the axles to go through to raise the car up to a more stock height. And that was fine except for the part where I was drilling just under the original holes to raise the car up just a little bit, and that was just enough to go through the chassis both in the front and the back, so I had to do a little patchwork after that. Fortunately, it was just a few tiny holes and a little bit of modeling putty filled it in right away. And again, because this is a weathered build, just a little typhus corrosion and Ryza rust over the top, and you'd never know it was there. Then a final black-brown wash over everything to blend all of the different weathering elements together. You'll notice I've finally wised up about working with an upside-down car on a dirty workspace, and I keep a roll of shop towels nearby for whenever I need a clean surface to flip the car over onto. I felt like the tailgate was missing a little bit more interest, so I had this jeweler's chain that I had dropped in some metallic bluing solution to give it a blackened look, and felt like the car could use a tow chain. So a quick snip and a little positioning with some tweezers, and I just secured it into place with a little Mod Podge mat and water. The white glue probably would have worked too, but I wanted to make sure I had a really matte finish on it. and Mod Podge matte does an excellent job of not having any shine to it. And it also dries very thin, so I didn't have any weird residue or gunk like I would have gotten from a CA glue. I didn't have a lot of decals in mind for this build, so I went back to my collection of license plates that I've made and printed out on a 4x6 bit of glossy photo paper. This is one of the patron benefits that you get when you join my Patreon, is you get access to all of my 3D and my graphic files, and you can download files like this one and have your own bit of go-to license plates for whatever project you have on hand. The license plate had a red border, so I went around it with a red pen just to make sure that the ends of the license plate looked natural and weren't too white. There was just a drop of white glue and laying the license plate in place. I went with a very malaise 55 mile an hour license plate. And with that, it was time for a Flying Valiant decal, and this car's official designation is Build 0009, written in my classic dyslexic out of order fashion. Okay, time to put a pin in this, so let's take a look at what we started with. It's a cool casting with a paint and tampo job pretty typical of a Hot Wheels that's been around a few years, and they're about to resort to coloring the glass to get some attention. Thank God they didn't for this one. And here's what we ended up with. A parts hauler that's seen better days but certainly has some life left in it. And the spiritual sister to the Three Blind Mice Nova build. Thank you again to Ben for hiring me to do this job. It was a lot of fun, and I really hope your dad enjoys this present. It was really cool that you thought of using some of my work as a gift, and I'm glad it's going to be giving someone joy. And I got to enjoy this car for all of 10 hours before I had to immediately turn around and stick it in the mail and get it to him. But it was a lot of fun to do, and I'm glad that I can share this build with you, and I have all these photos and videos that I can remember the car by. Don't forget to stick around to the end of the video for some more glamour shots of the build, but before that, a big thanks as always to my patrons who provided some of the supplies in this video, like I mentioned, the MIG filters and the Master Series metallic paint. You saw my Bandit level patrons at the start of this video, but I'd also like to shout out my Rockford level patrons. Evan at Mid-Island Custom Diecasts has his first video up on his YouTube channel, and it's fantastic, so please check it out through the link at the description below and subscribe to him. Also, my amazing wife, Carolyn, which reminds me to remind you to support your local educators. Douglas level patrons are the Drew Rants and Raves podcast, and my new patrons are Jordan Kleinhenn, thank you Jordan, and Curtis Crafts on YouTube. It's my friend Dave, and he has a really great crafting channel, a lot of cosplay and miniature stuff. I highly recommend you check it out. There's links to everyone's info in the description below. Please check them out. Also, thanks to my patrons, I've got a really special project coming up in August. They already know about this because as patrons, they get access to all sorts of cool stuff like behind the scenes access, sneak peeks, downloadables like the license plate sheet used in this video, and even one-on-one tutorials with me if they have a question about weathering. Plus, they have a monthly giveaway. Please check it out in the description below or visit patreon.com/flyingvaliant if you like what I do and you find yourself in a position to help keep things rolling. Speaking of which, I've got 2 more builds that I'm working on for this month, so I better get to those. Thanks again to everyone who's liked and subscribed and shared my videos. If you haven't yet, please do all the button pushes below this video. It really helps me out. As always, I want to thank you all for coming along with me for the ride. So until next time, stay fresh, cheese bags.